So I've seen discussions on Twitter about this comparison between Western comics and manga. During the pandemic, manga has kind of blown up in popularity, and I've noticed that more than ever. A lot of books that you'd normally be able to readily buy at Barnes & Noble or even on Amazon are sold out now. And there's been a lot of discussion about how American comics can't really keep up and haven't really been able to for years. And I kind of wanted to throw my hat into the discussion and talk about that experience and my experience with transitioning from American comics to manga, because I actually have a lot to say about this. This was actually primarily inspired by a Twitter thread by Deb Aoki. I'll link that in the description below, and I recommend reading it because she touches on a lot of the points that I have here, because I think this is an important discussion to have, especially for the future of the medium. Also, full disclosure, I've really only read Marvel, so I have no idea if DC significantly better with this stuff or more original, but I'm mainly speaking from the Marvel perspective. So I guess I first want to talk about my relationship with Marvel. So I started reading Marvel at a very early age, like I'm sure a lot of American kids. I distinctly remember these Marvel Masterworks series that I would read by the pool at the YMCA. I love these things, just the old school Spider-Man books. But this is really my first introduction to comic books. So I have a strong relationship with Spider-Man, and these kind of helped introduce me to that. When I got older, I started getting into actual current comics right around the time of Avengers vs. X-Men, around 2012, is when I really started reading. I think I was advertised to about it, and I thought it was a really cool idea. They were saying this was the one event that everything was leading into for all of the different storylines that they've done over the past 10 years. And I was like, oh my God, I gotta get in on this.
Marvel superheroes have seen it all. Breakouts, invasions, death, triumphant returns, and civil wars. Now, the Marvel Universe will yield its biggest story yet. Avengers versus X-Men.
So I started reading Avengers vs. X-Men, and I really dug it. I think it's a really good event still to this day. The tie-ins make sense. But that tie-in crossover event formula, I think, is one of the biggest reasons why comics these days are sort of in the state that they are. And I should mention, when it comes to these events, it's important to define them for people who may not be familiar with that term. So an event is kind of like a crossover special between all those different storylines. Usually there will be one singular major event in the Marvel Universe, and then there will be all kinds of tie-ins along with that. So an example would be whenever they resell them. This is Civil War, probably one of the most famous Marvel events. This is obviously not very long, and this has the main stories. So on the back, Civil War 1 through 7, this is the main story. However, for all of the characters who are involved in this giant story, they have their own tie-ins in their own series. So, for example, Spider-Man, in Amazing Spider-Man, there will be a tie-in event for Civil War, for example, and there was a very famous storyline that was a tie-in with Civil War. And part of it is obviously to get you to buy more comics, because these are major plot points that are only explored in these tie-ins. Like the Iron Spider suit is very famous, and that whole arc and his relationship with Tony Stark is really in the tie-ins primarily. So it's, there's major parts of Civil War that aren't even in that book. And for a while, I thought that was a fine idea, and I was content getting part of the story at the sake of the cost. I should mention, for a smaller event, like Age of Ultron, I have the hardcover here. This is a much bigger book, and this has all the tie-ins, and this wasn't even that big of an event. So this was I think the Civil War one was probably like $20. This one was $75. So much higher price point if you want the actual entire story. So I read comics for, I'd say, about 2, 3, 4 years. I think the last one that really sort of took me over the edge was Secret Wars. So Secret Wars was actually a pretty good idea. It was a way to slim down the Marvel Universe. There's so many different multiverses kind of happening at once. And the point of Secret Wars was to combine all of them, get rid of the Ultimate Universe and the regular 616 universe, which has, the main Marvel continuity, and to put them into one. In theory, I think that's a great idea, and the tie-ins actually did something creative where they were exploring a lot of these forgotten alternate realities, like Old Man Logan, that's a big one. 8 Days of Future Past, these one-off storylines, they make kind of mini-series out of them. So that was cool to see, but the main event for Secret Wars fucking sucked. Like, I really don't remember anything about that series and that main event. I do remember having to wait like months between issues, and when I got the new one, I forgot what had happened in the last one. And just in general, I think it was a really lackluster kind of main event. And that's really where the wool started to be taken back over my eyes with this whole Marvel comic format for events and stuff like that. And I started to see, I remember the first event after Avengers vs. X-Men, I think was Axis. And that also fucking blew. And they said the same thing where they were like, every single event in the past 10 years has been leading up to this moment. And I started to think, wow, maybe I'm an idiot and fell for a cheap marketing tagline. So after Secret Wars, I really sort of fall out of love with collecting comics. I've always collected manga throughout my life with a lot of the series I'd watch on Toonami and stuff like Dragon Ball and Naruto. But it wasn't until maybe a few years ago where I started collecting smaller series, stuff that I haven't really read before, and I just like the manga format so much better. And I think that's kind of how I want to segue into why manga is sort of a superior format in my opinion, and why it's beating American comics right now in popularity. It feels weird to even say that, considering that superheroes have been the biggest thing in pop culture for, I think, the past decade. And the fact that Marvel and I guess DC to an extent have not been able to ride that wave and have their comic books just be the most popular things ever is kind of their own fault. So, why is that? And I kind of want to speak to my sensibilities and three main things that I think make manga a lot more attractive for American audiences. So the first thing is collectability. So, there's something nice about owning a manga series, and for better or for worse, having the entire series in your hands. So, for example, Naruto, I have kind of back there, is one of the biggest manga series of all time. Viz has published all kinds of side stories, character books, prose novels. But if you really only care about that core Naruto story, you can buy all 72 volumes and you own it. There's no other, I guess besides Boruto, that's sort of a whole nother thing, but there's really not significant add-ons. You're not missing part of the story. The anime obviously has filler content, but that's really not the same thing as like what a lot of these tie-ins are for American comics. So you really have the entire story. And I think that's really attractive to me to say, hey, this series, I own all of it. It's right here. It's sort of this completionist aspect of my mentality. They're also more economical. I feel like for American comics, last time I bought them, which would be several years ago, usually it was like $4 for a single issue, and that was maybe like 20 pages versus manga. Obviously it's smaller, but you're getting a lot more book for a similar cost. So originally a manga could be about like $10 or so. Usually it's 175 to 200 pages. I just feel like I get more bang for a single volume of manga than $4 for an American comic that I'll read in like 15 minutes. It's also just easier to buy them. If you go to Barnes & Noble, they obviously have the trades in the comic book section, but for the single issues, if you really want to read what's current and not what's finished, I think my Barnes & Noble has all of the single issues by like the newspapers. They have like 2 or 3 series concurrently, and unless you have a comic book store near you, you're really kind of out of luck, which, don't get me wrong, I like going to comic book stores, but I think that it's a lot easier to get manga. Obviously, they've taken over Barnes & Noble, the manga section is gigantic now compared to what it was 10 plus years ago. On Amazon, for example, it's a lot harder to buy single issues. I don't even think Amazon sells single issues for themselves, usually through third parties if you try to look it up like that. So I wonder if there's maybe shipping issues, which is why they don't want to get into it. But again, the format is superior in that a lot of these other big retailers can sell manga a lot easier than they could these single issues. So they're obviously able to get in people's hands a lot easier. And there's also no gigantic events to buy. You know, a manga comes out, you buy it, you don't have to worry, am I getting the full story? It's there. So the collectability is just way better with manga. 2 is there's a singular vision. So manga is usually drawn and written by 1 or 2 people, obviously with assistance, but primarily it's one person's vision with not a lot of influence. So for example, in American comics, one popular character, like for example Spider-Man, if you want to get everything that's happening within the Spider-Man and all his supporting cast, you might have to buy 3, 4, 5, 6 series concurrently to get the full scope of what's going on, never mind an event. Like just off the top of my head, recently Spider-Man will have Amazing Spider-Man, Silk, Superior Foes of Spider-Man, Spider-Gwen, all this crap that you have to follow and keep up with week to week in order to stay current. So it's a lot, and again, compared to manga, it's drawn by so many different people. It's approved by, I'm sure, a gigantic bullpen of editors, and it just doesn't always feel like it's coming from one person because it's not. So it's not a homogeneous vision. The third thing that I think really puts manga above American comics would be the fact that manga really isn't influenced by outside factors. And this kind of plays into the second point, but specifically, comics are almost like commercials for other Marvel products. I think besides Secret Wars, the one other thing that sort of made me done with American comics was there was a summer, I think it was the summer where Captain America, Civil War, and Age of Apocalypse came out. I think they both came out the same summer. And coincidentally, the 2 summer events for Marvel were Civil War 2, which was god-awful, the only Brian Michael Bendis thing I think I've ever really strongly disliked, and X-Men, some variation of Age of Apocalypse. Now, you're telling me that the Marvel universe just perfectly aligned with these movies and this is what made the most sense at the time for them to write? No. I mean, it's frustrating to realize that these stories aren't being written because they're the thing that makes the most sense within the continuity of what's going on. They're written sometimes with marketing in mind. You know, hey, maybe we'll trick people into thinking this has to do with the movie if we call it the same thing as the movie that's coming out. So that's really frustrating to realize that, hey, what's happening in these Marvel comics, it's nothing to do with an overall story. We're just trying to do what makes the most sense for our bottom line. That's very frustrating. Also, Marvel comics are also influenced by the fact that at least the mainline Marvel universe is completely dependent on these characters surviving and thriving and continuing on for decades and decades. Spider-Man will never die, truly. Captain America will never be totally evil. Anything that they do can and will be reversed based on whatever is most convenient for them, whether commercially or otherwise. So that is, again, frustrating to realize that what's happening essentially means nothing, because just like that, it could be completely taken away. So manga, being a singular vision and not really impacted by a lot of outside factors, can kill someone and they're not brought back unless the creator wants them to and to make sense. So it's a lot less influenced by these other things. And Marvel can never escape that. No matter what they do, there's no situation where in the normal Marvel universe, Spider-Man will die and he will stay dead until the end of time. So my next point is to kind of go over how American comics can fix this. And I think it is a lot simpler than they want to believe. I know that sometimes they point the finger at art style. Like, that's the thing that really separates manga and American comics. But I think that's totally missing the point. I mean, I think making a manga with Iron Man on it is to somehow trick people into liking it. It's not going to work. And I think that they don't understand how flawed the American comic formula is, at least for superheroes. So if you want to look at a successful story that I think modern audiences will gravitate to, is just look no further than The Walking Dead. I actually recently read Walking Dead, and I really enjoyed it, and it's very similar to a manga in a lot of ways. Obviously, it's black and white. The pacing is a little bit different than a regular manga, but the idea that anything could happen, it has a TV show, but it does not feed into the comic books at all. It's very attractive to read something and realize, hey, anything could happen here. Anyone can die. If they die, they stay dead. That's the kind of stuff people are attracted to nowadays. I think Marvel realized this years ago in the 2000s, where the Ultimate Universe almost, was one of the big things that revived them from bankruptcy. Is these super interesting stories in the Ultimate Universe where if someone died, they stayed dead. They could kill off major characters because that wasn't the main continuity. And they created a lot of lovable storylines, a lot of lovable characters, and they played with a lot of these older ideas, and they weren't beholden to decisions and character designs that were finalized in the 60s, So audiences gravitated towards that because no one can really get on board with a story where nothing matters, and that's what manga offers. So I think creating more storylines like that is really the key, where you have creator-driven stories, art, honestly less collaboration, as weird as that sounds, and trying to get weird and interesting with it. One of my absolute favorite comic book storylines of all time is Old Man Logan, which was this completely one-off universe. Now it's like a mainline series, but Mark Millar just did his own thing along with Steve McNiven to create this universe where there were no rules, and how he tweaked this post-apocalyptic Marvel universe was super interesting and fresh. That's the kind of stuff people gravitate to, so just look at Invincible is another manga, it's another comic book series that is sold out everywhere because, again, written by Robert Kirkman, and it is a no-nonsense story where there are consequences. That's the kind of stuff people like. So by having more creator-driven comic books where there are more consequences, I think that's the only way you can really get modern audiences to jump on board. So that's really all I had. I am hoping that one day Marvel starts putting out more interesting stuff that might pull me back in. But for now, I am enjoying collecting manga. I think it's a lot more interesting than American comics, at least right now. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are a million IDW independent comics that are creator-driven and a lot more interesting than what's popular. I just think that I don't think they're as collectible as manga, and I just think that what's happening in the manga space is a lot more interesting and exciting than American comics, at least from what I know. That being said, if you disagree with anything I've said or have recommendations for manga or American comics that are more creator-driven that you think I might enjoy, please let me know in the comments, and I'd be happy to check those out. So, as always, thank you for watching.